Okay, moving on, we want to look at some just general review of the next scale that we'll talk about, which is behavioral functioning. And sorry, I'm just going to reset my phone so that I can keep the timer going. So behavioral functioning is a really important place to help the client. And part of this is because when clients rate the help that they receive in a crisis intervention after the crisis is over, one of the things that clients talk about is how good it felt to actually take an action and to do something. And so this is an area where if we can get the client mobilized enough to take a sensible and useful and constructive action, it will help them start to feel more in control than before. And so remember, during a crisis, a lot of us get super immobilized, and thus we need some assistance to do something constructive. We just almost need to do, have some help in taking some action. So here are some questions that you can think about to yourself when thinking about the behavioral scale. In cases like this in the past, this is a question you can ask the client. In cases like this in the past, what did you do that helped you get back in control? This is sort of like in the ABC model when we're asking about the client's coping mechanisms. What did you use in the past that was helpful? So this is related to behavior. Or you could ask the client, what would you like to do now to get back on top of this situation? And the client might say, I don't know what to do. And you could then say, well, I have a couple of suggestions, or I have a suggestion of a couple of choices. Would you like to hear those? And let's evaluate whether one is better than another. Another question to consider or to ask the client, is there anyone who, if you contacted them right now, would be supportive of you in this crisis? And so here we're looking for resources. And this is also a part of something that we talk about in the ABC model, isn't it? What kind of resources do you have? Financial resources, human resources, social, behavioral resources. Remember, we've talked about that before too. In the behavioral area, there are some general sort of reactions that we're going to see, and there are three of them. Is the client approaching the problem? Are they actively engaged in wanting to do something about it? Or are they avoiding the problem? Are they engaging in denial or repression or just inactivity? Or is the client just completely immobile? Which one of these kind of coping behaviors is being used in the behavioral section? So once a client gets involved in doing something concrete, a step in the positive direction, an element of control is restored. So just remember that as you think about the behavioral scale. And then finally, let's look at the cognitive functioning or cognitive state scale. Here, if we listen and observe carefully, this is where we can find out, if the client's thinking is rational and logical for the crisis situation. Is what you're hearing the client talking about making sense to you? Or to what extent is the client maybe awfulizing or exaggerating or catastrophizing this situation? Or are they kind of engaging in, believing in half-truths or rumors that they don't even have substantiation for? Also, we can look at how long has the client, or think about how long has the client been engaged in crisis thinking? And can you tell if the client is open to changing their beliefs about the situation? And, can you tell if you offer a reframe, if the client might be willing to accept thinking about this crisis in a different way? And remember, according to Christy Canal and her model for crisis intervention, the ABC model, she really strongly feels that it's our cognitions that cause us the most suffering. And so, that's part of what we want to look at when we're considering the client's cognitive functioning. There are some other little tiny pieces of this that we haven't talked about before. And with cognitions, sometimes the client is thinking in ways of whether the event is a transgression or a threat, or it's a loss that they're experiencing. And so a transgression is something that's happening right now that the client is experiencing. And obviously, the client might be interpreting this crisis as a threat, that something could happen, or it's going to happen. Well, not that it's going to happen, but that it could happen, that it's possible that it's going to happen. And then the last one I said was loss, that the crisis involves something that's already happened and it's been a loss to them. And just to get a little further in the weeds with this, the areas that clients might be considering this transgression or threat or loss may have to do with their social and human relationships. It may have to do with their spiritual or moral sense of being. It could have to do with just their physical life, whether they have food and shelter and those kinds of things. Or it could be related to their psychological domain. So those things are all related to how the client is functioning cognitively. So we've reviewed all three of these scales just in a very general sense. The scale having to do with the client's emotional or affective functioning. We talked also about the client's sense of behavior and what they're doing, or how frozen or unfrozen they are. And then lastly, we just talked a little bit about cognitions and the role that they have in letting us see and assess, how severe the client is experiencing this crisis to be. So let's talk a little bit about the rating that's used on the triage assessment form. It's a pretty simple scale. Each of these three areas that we've talked about, affect, behavior, and cognitions, you'll be assessing on a scale from 1 to 10 in terms of how impaired the person is. So a score of 1 is, the client being not impaired very much at all, or not at all actually. And then obviously a scale score of 10 would mean that the client is in a severe state of impairment. And so overall, with these three scales, you can have a low of a score of 3, which would indicate that the client might be experiencing a crisis, but they're not really very much impacted by it. They're not having difficulty functioning at all. Whereas if a client has a score all the way up between 20 and 30, this is more of a danger zone where the client is experiencing a lot of impairment and interpreting this crisis with much severity. Now, oddly, the theorists who developed the triage assessment form suggest that we start by looking at the higher levels of impairment on each of these scales. So as we're maybe talking to the client, and you could even have this assessment form in front of you. There's nothing secretive about having an assessment scale. And if I were working with a client and I wanted to use the triage assessment form, I might just say, I have in front of me this scale that helps me think about how bad this crisis is for you and how much it's causing impairment for you, and I'm just going to be making some marks on it, and I'll be glad to show it to you as we finish. We can talk about it. So don't ever feel, as you're using an assessment form, that you have to hide that from the client. In fact, I think that's a bad thing to do, because clients, they need to be able to trust us. And, if we're transparent about what we're doing, that just helps the client feel more in control and less like they're, under some kind of a threat. So definitely feel free to talk with your client about it. So again, I just want to emphasize that when we use the impairment scales in our practice in the collaborate session on Wednesday together, when we do some practicing, we're going to be starting thinking about the higher levels of impairment. And part of the reasoning for this too is just to rule out how dangerous the situation is and how much lethality could be contained in the situation. So at first, does the client's affect or behavior or thinking meet the descriptors that fall under what severe affect or severe behavior or severe cognitions look like? And so what you can do as you're practicing with this is maybe use a pencil and start at the higher end of those scales, and you can read these small descriptors that are under each of the scoring levels. And if you can make a check mark in the most severe category, if you make more than half of those check marks of behaviors that you're seeing or that are evidenced in the client, then there's a pretty good chance that the client is experiencing this crisis in a pretty severe way. Also, maybe this is a good time to say, scores between 20 and 30 have much higher levels of lethality associated with them, and the client is much more out of control, much less able to stay out of harm's way. Even if they're not premeditating a bad behavior like homicide or suicide, they may just fall out of control if their scores are up in the upper 20s. So that's something that is important for us to think about. Let's see, what else do I want to say about this? We've already talked about the scale can be in a rating from as low as 3 points up to 30 points. And just generally, overall scale rating from 3 to 10 means that the client is just not experiencing a lot of impairment. They're probably able to self-direct. They may just need to talk things out with us and get some feedback. A client whose scores tend to be more between 11 and 19, sort of in that middle range, might need some help and suggestions and directions. And so we should be prepared to offer the kinds of interventions that you know to do using your ABC model. Remember, we talked about things like education statements or empowerment statements or referrals or validations or other kinds of offerings of information, education about the particular crisis. So all of that kind of stuff is something that a client who's scoring in the mid-range would be able to take good advantage of. And then, as I mentioned to you lastly, scores that fall between 20 and 30 are very much scores that we want to be much more concerned about, and also the client might need us to be more directive in helping them to de-escalate. They may need us to help them certainly with grounding kinds of exercises, breathing, meditative, calming kinds of behaviors are the things that might actually be the things we have to do first with a client who has scores in this severe category. So I hope that's enough of an introduction to this triage assessment form that we're going to work with on Wednesday, and I look forward to seeing you then. I have sent you an email. Those of you who are watching this may also know that I think it's probably a good idea for you to print this off of your our Moodle page and have it in front of you so that you can be flipping pages and talking about this more easily than flipping in and out of your screen for Collaborate. So I highly suggest that you make a copy of it if it's possible for you. Okay, I'll see you Wednesday. Thanks.